Dorothy was the most dedicated volunteer at St. Mark's Community Church. She arrived before sunrise to help with breakfast preparation, stayed through lunch service, and was always the last to leave after evening cleanup. The pastor admired her commitment. Then one night, someone forgot their keys and returned to find Dorothy quietly sleeping in the back pew, and realized their most devoted volunteer had nowhere else to go. St. Mark's Community Church on Elm Street had always prided itself on serving the neighborhood's most vulnerable residents. 3 times a week, volunteers prepared hot meals for anyone who needed them. They organized clothing drives, food pantries, and emergency assistance programs. The church's motto, painted above the main entrance, read, "All are welcome here." Dorothy Williams had been volunteering at St. Mark's for 3 years, and in that time, she had become indispensable. At 62 years old, she arrived every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, an hour before the breakfast program officially began. She'd unlock the kitchen with her volunteer key, start the coffee, and begin preparing for the day's service. By the time other volunteers arrived at 7 a.m., Dorothy had already set up the serving line, organized supplies, and made everything ready for the morning rush. Dorothy Williams had been volunteering at St. Mark's for 3 years, and in that time she had become indispensable. At 62 years old, she arrived every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, an hour before the breakfast program officially began. She'd unlock the kitchen with her volunteer key, start the coffee, and begin preparing for the day's service. By the time other volunteers arrived at 7 a.m., Dorothy had already set up the serving line, organized supplies, and made everything ready for the morning rush. What struck other volunteers most was Dorothy's dedication. While most people served 1 shift per week, Dorothy was there for breakfast, lunch, and dinner service. She helped with food preparation, served meals, cleaned tables, and handled the extensive cleanup that followed each service. She never complained about the long hours, never seemed tired, and never asked for anything in return. "Dorothy is a blessing," Pastor Michael Rodriguez often told congregation members. "I've never met anyone so committed to serving others. She's the first one here and the last to leave." But what Pastor Rodriguez and the other volunteers didn't realize was that Dorothy's extraordinary dedication came from necessity rather than choice. Dorothy wasn't just serving at St. Mark's, she was living there. Dorothy had lost her apartment 18 months earlier, when her fixed income could no longer cover rising rent costs. She had worked as a home health aide for 30 years, but when arthritis made the physical demands of the job too difficult, she was forced to retire on a small Social Security check that barely covered basic expenses. When her landlord raised her rent by $400 per month, Dorothy faced an impossible choice: food or housing. She chose food, packed her few belongings into 2 suitcases, and quietly began the terrifying transition from housed to homeless. But Dorothy refused to see herself as just another person needing help. Instead, she found St. Mark's volunteer program and threw herself into service with the determination of someone who understood that dignity came through contribution, not just survival. The church became Dorothy's sanctuary in the most literal sense. She arrived early not just to help, but because it gave her a safe, warm place to spend her days. She stayed late, not just from dedication, but because the longer she remained useful, the longer she could delay facing the unsafe streets. Dorothy had developed an intricate system for living invisibly within the church community. She kept her suitcases locked in a storage closet that she had access to as a volunteer. She used the church bathroom to wash and change clothes, timing her personal care around the volunteer schedule so no one would notice. She did laundry at a nearby laundromat once a week, always maintaining the neat, clean appearance that people expected from a church volunteer. Most challenging of all, Dorothy had to find places to sleep without being discovered. She rotated between different locations within the church, sometimes the education wing classroom, sometimes the back pew of the main sanctuary, occasionally the fellowship hall during the week when no evening events were scheduled. Dorothy lived in constant fear of being found out. She worried that if the church leadership discovered her situation, they would have to ask her to leave, both because of liability issues and because her presence might make other volunteers uncomfortable. The thought of losing her volunteer position, and with it her housing, terrified her more than the physical discomfort of sleeping on pews and living out of suitcases. So Dorothy maintained her secret with the same meticulous attention she brought to her volunteer duties. She was always gone from wherever she'd slept before anyone arrived in the morning. She never left any trace of her presence in the spaces she used, and she channeled all her anxiety about her situation into even greater dedication to serving others. The discovery came on a Tuesday evening in November. Pastor Rodriguez had been conducting a late meeting in his office when he realized he'd forgotten to lock up the main sanctuary. He returned to the church around 9 p.m., expecting to find the building empty and secure. Instead, he found Dorothy sleeping peacefully in the back pew, her coat folded neatly as a pillow and her purse clutched securely in her arms. Pastor Rodriguez stood in the doorway for several minutes, trying to process what he was seeing. His first thought was concern. Had Dorothy fallen ill during her volunteer shift? But as he looked more closely, he noticed the deliberately arranged sleeping setup, the suitcase tucked discreetly under the pew, and the careful way Dorothy had positioned herself to be as invisible as possible. Slowly, the reality of the situation began to dawn on him. Dorothy wasn't there because of a medical emergency or volunteer duties that had run late. She was there because she lived there. Pastor Rodriguez quietly withdrew without waking Dorothy, but he spent the rest of the night thinking about what he had discovered. How long had Dorothy been homeless? How had he and the other church leaders failed to notice that their most dedicated volunteer was also one of the vulnerable people they served? The next morning, Pastor Rodriguez arrived early, before Dorothy's usual 6 a.m. arrival time. When she walked through the church doors with her characteristic punctuality and quiet determination, he was waiting for her in the kitchen. "Dorothy," he said gently, "we need to talk." Dorothy's face went pale. She had been discovered, and she knew her sanctuary was about to be taken away from her. "Pastor, I can explain," she began, but Pastor Rodriguez held up his hand. "Dorothy, first I want you to know that you're not in trouble. But I found you sleeping in the sanctuary last night, and I think we need to discuss your situation." Dorothy sat down heavily in one of the metal folding chairs, the careful composure she had maintained for months finally cracking. "I didn't want to be a burden," she said quietly. "I just needed a safe place to stay, and I thought if I could be useful enough, maybe no one would mind." Pastor Rodriguez felt his heart breaking as he listened to Dorothy explain her situation. Here was a woman who had spent 3 years serving the church's homeless population while hiding the fact that she was homeless herself. She had maintained her dignity through service, refusing to see herself as just another person needing charity. "Dorothy, why didn't you come to us for help? That's what we're here for." Dorothy's response revealed the complex emotions that many people experience when facing homelessness: shame, fear, and a desperate desire to maintain dignity. "I've been taking care of myself my whole life," she said. "I didn't want people to see me differently, to treat me like someone who needed pity instead of someone who could contribute." Pastor Rodriguez realized that Dorothy's approach, while heartbreaking, was actually quite wise. She had found a way to address her housing crisis while maintaining her sense of purpose and self-worth. The problem wasn't Dorothy's strategy. It was the church's failure to create systems that would have allowed her to ask for help without sacrificing her dignity. That conversation marked the beginning of a transformation, not just in Dorothy's situation, but in how St. Mark's approached serving their community. Pastor Rodriguez called an emergency meeting of the church board to discuss Dorothy's situation and what it revealed about their service programs. He realized that their model of charity, church members helping those people who needed assistance, created barriers that prevented community members like Dorothy from accessing help when they needed it. The board's first priority was ensuring Dorothy had safe, stable housing immediately. Within a week, they had arranged for Dorothy to move into a small apartment with the church covering the security deposit and first month's rent. But more importantly, they restructured their assistance programs to create more dignity-preserving ways for community members to access help. Dorothy's story prompted the church to examine how many other people might be serving as volunteers while secretly needing the services they helped provide. They discovered several other volunteers who were struggling with food insecurity, utility assistance needs, and other challenges, but had been too proud or afraid to ask for help. The church developed new approaches that recognized the complex relationship between giving and receiving help. They created work programs that allowed people to earn assistance through service, established mutual aid networks where community members could both give and receive support, and trained volunteers to recognize when fellow servers might also need assistance. Dorothy became central to these new programs, not as a recipient of charity, but as a leader who understood both sides of the service equation. Her experience gave her unique insights into creating programs that preserved dignity while providing essential support. But perhaps most importantly, Dorothy's story changed how the congregation thought about homelessness and poverty. She had shattered their assumptions about what homeless people looked like and how they behaved. Dorothy was neat, reliable, hard-working, and contributed far more to the church than she had ever received. Dorothy taught us that the line between those who serve and those who are served is much thinner than we thought. Pastor Rodriguez would later explain to other churches. Some of our most dedicated volunteers are also our most vulnerable community members. Dorothy helps train new volunteers to recognize signs that fellow servers might also need support, and she works with other churches to develop service models that create space for mutual aid rather than one-way charity. Her message is simple but powerful. Everyone wants to feel useful. Sometimes the people who serve the most are the ones who need help the most, because service gives us a sense of purpose that charity alone never can. When people ask Dorothy about her experience of hidden homelessness, her response reflects the complex relationship between pride, necessity, and community support. "I wasn't trying to deceive anyone. I was trying to survive while still being the person I wanted to be. The church didn't just give me a place to live, they gave me a way to maintain my dignity while getting the help I needed." Now, I ask you, have you ever encountered someone whose dedication to helping others was driven by their own hidden struggles? Someone who found dignity through service, even while facing personal challenges? Share their story in the comments below, because here at Silent Heroes, we believe that the most generous hearts often belong to people who understand what it means to need help. Thank you for watching. If this story changed how you think about homelessness and community service, subscribe to help us share more stories about hidden struggles and quiet courage. Hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who works with vulnerable populations. And remember that sometimes the people serving our communities are also the people who need our community's support. Until next time, look closer at the volunteers and helpers in your community. Some of them might be heroes, not just because of what they give, but because of what they've overcome to keep giving.